Ma'am, stay in the vehicle. Hands where I can see them.
My hands are right here. Is there a problem, officer?
You pulled into this driveway. What are you doing here?
I live here. I'm just getting home from work.
This neighborhood's had issues. You don't look like you live on this block.
This is my home. That's my front door. I have my keys and ID.
Step away.
The first time the officer saw her, she wasn't wearing a robe. She was wearing a simple navy blazer, sensible heels, and the tired posture of someone who had just finished another 13-hour day, trying to keep the justice system from collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. She pulled her car into the driveway of a brick townhome on a quiet, tree-lined street. Porch lights glowed. A neighbor's TV flickered blue through thin curtains. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked at nothing. To anyone else, it was an ordinary scene. To him, it was a problem. The squad car eased to a stop just past her driveway, reversing a few feet so its headlights washed over her license plate, the back of her head, the trunk of her car. The engine growled, low and territorial. She put the car in park, exhaled, and reached for her briefcase. The red and blue lights came on. Federal Judge Alana Pierce froze, one hand still on the leather handle. It wasn't the first time she'd seen those lights in her career. She'd watched hours of body cam footage in civil rights cases. She'd read transcripts of traffic stops gone wrong, arrests that started over nothing and spiraled into tragedy. But this was the first time the lights were bouncing off her own front windows. A voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Step out of the vehicle, slowly, hands where I can see them." Her heart thudded once, hard, not from guilt, from recognition. She knew this script. Only this time, she wasn't on the bench, she was in the crosshairs. This is the story of how a routine drive home turned into a racial profiling nightmare. How a cop's arrogance and lies collided with a federal judge who refused to disappear quietly. And how, in the end, it cost him his badge, his freedom, and 15 years of his life. Judge Alana Pierce had spent her entire career believing in the promise of the law. Not because it always worked, but because she knew what happened when it didn't. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where sirens were a lullaby, and police helicopters painted circles of light over backyards at night. Her mother used to say, "The law is like rain. It doesn't fall the same on every roof." Alana decided early that if she couldn't control the clouds, she was at least going to learn everything about the storm. She went to law school, clerked for a federal judge, and eventually became one herself, one of the youngest black women to sit on a federal bench in her district. In the courtroom, the robe gave her power. On the street that night, it might as well have been invisible. She pulled her keys from her purse and stepped out of the car slowly, every movement deliberate. "Officer!" she called across the hood, her voice steady despite the spike of adrenaline. "Is there a problem? This is my home." He stepped out of the cruiser, door swinging wide like a shield. The nameplate on his chest read, R. Keller, early 30s, white, jaw clenched like he'd been waiting all day for something to push back against. His hand rested near his holster, not on it, but close enough to send a message. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood," he said. "You match the description, license and registration, now." She blinked. "A suspicious vehicle?" she repeated. "This vehicle has been parked in this driveway for the last 6 years. I'm Judge Pierce. I live here." He smirked. "Oh, you're a judge," he said, making the word sound like a joke. "And I'm the president, license and registration." That was the first crack. Not in her composure, in his defense. Because body cameras don't care about ego. They don't trim out the sneer in your voice or the way you turn someone's title into a threat. His was already recording. Quick question for you watching. Have you ever seen someone's entire attitude change the moment they learn who they're talking to? Drop a yes in the comments if you have. Or if you've watched officers treat people one way, right up until they find out they have power or a title. And if stories like this matter to you, Stories that peel back what really happens when the law is used like a weapon instead of a shield. Go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. Now, back to the driveway, because this officer was about to double down on the worst decision of his career. Judge Pierce reached into her purse slowly, narrating her movements like she had taught her own son to do. "I'm reaching for my wallet," she said. "I am complying." "You don't need to narrate," Keller snapped. "Just do what you're told." Her fingers brushed over her judicial ID badge, the one she wore inside the courthouse, and for a moment she considered pulling it out. Not to flex, not to threaten, but to shortcut whatever this was before it got worse. Then she heard the echo of 100 arguments she'd heard from the bench. Why should she have to? She handed over her driver's license instead. He took it without looking at the address. "Step back to the curb," he ordered. "Keep your hands where I can see them." She glanced at her front door. A light flickered in the living room window. Her 16-year-old son, Marcus, had been waiting up for her. No doubt he was watching this, phone in hand, recording. She stepped back. The chill from the concrete seeped through her heels. "Officer Keller," she said, keeping her voice even. "Again, I'm asking, what exactly is the alleged violation here?" He didn't answer. He was staring at his computer screen, running her name through every system he had access to. Driver's records, warrants, anything he could hook into. The thing about power is, when people are used to exercising it unquestioned, any boundary feels like a challenge, and Keller was not used to being challenged. Across the street, behind a half-closed blind, a neighbor watched the scene unfold. She was the one who had called 911. In her mind, the sight of a black woman in a dark sedan pulling into the driveway after 10 p.m. didn't add up. It didn't matter that she'd seen that same car there 100 times before. It didn't matter that she'd waved to Marcus on his way to school. What mattered was the story she told herself in the moment. "Something's off," she told the dispatcher. "I don't recognize her. She's just sitting there. It looks suspicious." Suspicious, the most elastic word in modern policing. It can stretch to cover almost anything. A hoodie, a skin tone, a neighborhood that someone decides is too nice for the person standing in it. The dispatcher logged the call. Officers were dispatched, and because Keller rolled up already believing he was responding to something suspicious, he never stopped to consider the possibility that the only thing actually suspicious about this scene was his own bias. On the driveway, the tension climbed. "I'm not seeing you in the system," he said finally, a hint of accusation in his voice. She frowned. "You typed my name correctly? Pierce. "I know how to type," he shot back. "Are you on probation? Using a different name?" There it was, the assumption. He couldn't find a problem, so he started trying to invent one. She took a breath. "Officer, I'm done playing 20 questions. If I'm being detained, tell me why. If I'm not, I'm going inside my home." She took one step toward her front door. He moved fast. "Ma'am, do not walk away from me," he barked, closing the distance. His hand snapped out, grabbing her arm. Pain shot up her shoulder. "Let go of me," she said sharply. "That's not necessary. I live here." "You're resisting," he said, which was not true, but sounded very official on camera. The problem for him was that his camera wasn't the only one. Marcus, from the window, had been recording the whole thing. His angle showed exactly what happened. His mother standing still. The officer stepping in, his hand clamping around her arm first. "Turn around," Keller ordered. "Hands behind your back." "You are not arresting me in my own driveway," she said, incredulous. "Last chance," he snapped. "You want to play games? We'll play at the station." He spun her around. Metal cuffs bit into her wrists. Her briefcase fell to the ground, papers spilling across the driveway like a broken promise. Inside the house, Marcus's voice cracked on the video. "Mom!" The ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and brutal clarity. In the back of the patrol car, wrists throbbing, shoulders pressed against hard plastic, Judge Pierce's mind raced. She thought about her docket for the next morning. Defendants who would be standing in front of an empty bench if she didn't show up. She thought about every black parent who had ever warned their child about exactly this kind of encounter, and how surreal it felt to be living the script she'd spent years trying to keep other families from experiencing. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly from the back seat. "Yeah?" Keller replied, without turning around. "We'll see what the system has to say about that." He had no idea who he'd just put in handcuffs, but the system he trusted so much was about to introduce itself. By name. At the station, they walked her in like every other arrestee, through the side entrance, past the holding cells, past the bulletin board where her own framed photo hung in a lineup of federal judges who occasionally toured the facility. The booking officer glanced up, pen ready, then did a double take. "Judge Pierce?" he said, his voice cracking on the second word. Keller stiffened. "You know her?" he asked. The booking officer swallowed. "Yes, I know her," he said slowly. "She's a sitting federal judge. What is she doing here in cuffs?" For the first time all night, a sliver of doubt crossed Keller's face, but instead of backing down, he doubled up. "She was resisting," he said. "Couldn't ID where she lived, acting suspicious. I think she's lying about who she is." He had just made a second mistake, lying. Because the booking officer, like half the courthouse staff, had seen Judge Pierce in person. He'd stood in her courtroom. He knew her voice, her face, her reputation. "I don't think she's lying," he said carefully. "I think you need to call your supervisor right now." Within minutes, the watch commander arrived. He took one look at the woman sitting in the holding area, wrists still marked red from the cuffs, blazer rumpled, expression a mix of fury and cold control, and his stomach dropped. "Your Honor," he said, using the title instinctively. "What happened?" She looked straight at Keller when she answered. "Ask your officer," she said. "I've already told him who I am. He decided not to believe me. Now I'd like my phone call, and I'd like to know which internal affairs number I should be dialing tomorrow morning." From that moment on, the story had two tracks. One of them was internal. Meetings, reports, nervous glances in hallways, supervisors whispering in offices with closed doors. The other track was external, because Marcus had already sent his video to a friend. That friend had already posted it. By sunrise, thousands of people had watched a grainy clip of a black woman being handcuffed in her own driveway, while calmly explaining that she lived there. They didn't know she was a judge yet, but they didn't need to. The injustice was obvious without the title. When local reporters started making calls, the department tried their usual strategy: generic phrases about an ongoing investigation and officers responding to a call. Then someone leaked the rest, the internal email acknowledging that the arrestee was, in fact, a sitting federal judge. The incident report, in which Keller had written that she refused to identify herself, attempted to flee into the residence, and became physically combative. All statements that, when compared to the combined footage from his body cam and Marcus's phone, were not just misleading, they were lies. And lying in a police report about someone's conduct isn't just unethical. When that someone is a federal official, it starts to look a lot like a federal crime. If you were in Judge Pierce's shoes right then, humiliated in front of your neighbors, arrested in front of your child, lied about in official paperwork, what would you do? Would you let an internal investigation quietly handle it? Or would you take it somewhere much bigger? Let me know in the comments what you think you'd do, because Judge Pierce did what she'd urged countless others to do from the bench when their rights were violated. She went to the feds, not as a judge, as a victim. The Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office didn't need a lot of convincing. They had tape, they had reports, they had an officer who had turned a baseless 911 call into a physical detention, then put his thumb on the scale of justice by lying about it. And they had a complainant who understood the law well enough to help them build the case. The charge that eventually came down was serious: deprivation of rights under color of law. On top of that, there were counts for falsifying records, obstruction, and making false statements. For years, Judge Pierce had sat on the bench listening to prosecutors read charges like that against other defendants. Now she sat in the gallery as those words were read to a man who had put her in handcuffs and smirked. "How do you plead?" the clerk asked. "Not guilty," Keller said. He was still betting that the system he'd always leaned on would lean back in his favor. He was wrong. At trial, the prosecution didn't have to gild anything. They just pressed play. Jurors watched the driveway encounter from multiple angles. They saw a black woman standing calmly in front of her own home. They heard her identify herself. They watched an officer dismiss her words, escalate physical contact, and narrate resistance where none existed. They read his report. Then they watched the tape again. The gap between what he wrote and what actually happened was big enough to drive a patrol car through. On the stand, Keller tried to spin it. He talked about officer safety, high crime areas, and non-compliant subjects. The prosecutor let him talk, then started asking questions. "Did Judge Pierce ever raise her voice at you?" "No." "Did she ever threaten you?" "No." "Did she ever step toward you aggressively?" "No, she stepped toward her door." "Which is her legal right if she's not being detained, correct?" He shifted in his seat. "I believed she was being detained." "But you never told her that, did you?" Silence. "And you wrote in your report that she attempted to flee, correct?" The prosecutor continued. "Yes." "Can you point on this video to the exact moment where she attempts to flee?" They played it again. The jurors watched and watched. There was no flight, only a woman turning towards her front door. The prosecutor didn't have to raise his voice. The footage did the shouting for him. In closing arguments, the government did something simple and devastating. They reminded the jury that this case wasn't just about a bad report or a rough arrest. It was about what it means when someone with a badge learns that they can lie and expects the system to back them up. "If this can happen to a federal judge," the prosecutor said, "what do you think happens when the person in those handcuffs is a teenager with no title, no platform, and no camera in the window?" The courtroom went quiet. The question hung there, heavy, because everyone in that room knew the answer. It happens every day. The only difference here was who the victim was and how much proof there was. The jury didn't deliberate for long. When they filed back into the room, their faces were set. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law," the foreperson read, "we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of falsifying records, guilty. On the charge of obstruction, guilty." The words landed like hammer blows. For once, they weren't landing on the usual people. They were landing on the man who'd put himself above the rules he was sworn to uphold. At sentencing, the judge, a colleague of Alana's who had recused her from any involvement beyond testifying, didn't mince words. "Mr. Keller," he said, "you were entrusted with the authority to enforce the law. You used that authority to target a citizen without cause, to lie about her, and to cover your misconduct with the power of the state. The fact that your victim is a federal judge only makes clearer what could happen to someone with less power." He paused. "For that, this court finds that a significant sentence is warranted. 15 years, not on one charge alone, but stacked across multiple counts. 15 years to sit with the reality that the system he'd assumed would always protect him had turned around and held him accountable. His career wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. Badge gone, pension gone, freedom gone for a very long time. After the sentencing, cameras swarmed Judge Pierce as she left the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions. "Do you feel vindicated? Do you think the sentence was too harsh? What message do you think this sends to other officers?" She stopped long enough to say one thing. "This was never about me being a judge," she said. "It was about what happens when anyone is treated like a criminal for existing in their own neighborhood. My hope is that this case sends a message. Not that every mistake deserves prison, but that deliberate abuse of power does." She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she just walked to her car, the same car she'd been pulled out of in cuffs months earlier. This time, no one stopped her. At home, the driveway looked different now. Not physically, the same concrete, the same front steps, the same front door. But to Marcus, it wasn't just where you parked anymore. It was where he'd watched his mother, the strongest person he knew, be treated like she was nothing. It was where he'd learned, in one brutal night, exactly how fragile dignity can feel when someone else holds the power to take it away. In the months after the arrest, he had had trouble sleeping, flinched at the sound of sirens, avoided looking out the window when a patrol car drove by. After the verdict, some of that weight eased, not all of it. Accountability doesn't erase trauma, but it does shift the story. "Does this mean they'll stop doing this to people?" he asked her one night at the dinner table. She didn't lie to him. "No," she said softly. "It doesn't mean that, but it means this. When they do, sometimes there are consequences. And every time there are consequences, it gets a little harder for people to pretend it doesn't happen." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad you didn't just let it go," he said. "Me too," she replied. "Not just for us. For the next person who doesn't have a robe, or a title, or a camera." At the end of the day, this story isn't just about a cop who lost his job and his freedom. It's about a system that, for once, looked in the mirror and didn't flinch. It's about how easy it is to label someone suspicious when they don't fit the picture in your head of who belongs where, and how dangerous that label becomes when you have the power to turn it into handcuffs and criminal charges. It's about the difference between mistakes and choices. A mistake is a typo in a report. A choice is grabbing someone who isn't a threat, twisting their arm, and calling it resistance. A mistake is mispronouncing a name. A choice is hearing someone tell you exactly who they are, and deciding you don't believe them because what you see doesn't match your prejudice. Officer Keller didn't go to prison because someone ruined his life over a minor misunderstanding. He went because he took the authority that came with his badge and aimed it at an innocent person, and then tried to cover that up with lies. The fact that person happened to be a federal judge just meant his target could finally shoot back. With the law. So the next time you see a headline about racial profiling and career consequences, remember this driveway. Remember the neighbor behind the blinds, dialing 911, not because she saw a crime, but because she saw a person she didn't expect. Remember the officer who treated suspicion like proof. Remember the judge who refused to shrink herself to make him comfortable. And remember the jury that watched the tape, weighed the evidence, and decided that rights on paper don't mean anything if violating them has no cost. Because until more cases end like this, with real accountability, not just vague retraining and quiet transfers, the rain her mother talked about will keep falling unevenly, harder on some roofs than others, and stories like this one will keep happening. We'll keep telling them, and somewhere out there, another officer will have a choice to make the next time they roll up on a driveway, a park bench, a church door. Do they see a threat, or a neighbor, a suspect, or a citizen? The difference between those answers is the difference between a routine stop and another career obliterated, another life shattered, another 15-year reminder that power, misused, never stays buried forever.